What happened in Jerusalem has left many people searching for answers. It began with violent weather. A sudden hailstorm struck the ancient city, followed by powerful thunder and lightning that shook the sky. Heavy rain poured across the region for hours until floodwaters swallowed entire streets. But the storm itself was not what unsettled people the most. Moments before the sky cleared, many witnesses claimed they saw something extraordinary above the city. A radiant figure of Jesus appearing in the sky, surrounded by what looked like angels. Within hours, videos and testimonies began spreading across social media, leaving believers and observers asking the same question. What did people really see that night? Scripture often describes angels as messengers sent to carry out God's will. As Hebrews 1:14 says, "Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation?" But the appearance of angels alongside Jesus in Jerusalem at a time of war, political tension, and in global uncertainty has led many to wonder whether something deeper may be unfolding. Is this simply a misunderstanding? Or could it be a moment that people will one day look back on as something far greater? Let's take a closer look at what happened. Amidst the turbulence of the Israel-Iran war and the international scrutiny, Jerusalem, the ancient city, has become the stage for celestial spectacles. In the middle of spring, a season when people normally expect warm, clear skies and occasional light rain, the sky delivered something very different. The clouds had been gathering for hours, stretching across the horizon like a heavy blanket. The air felt unusually still, almost tense, as if the atmosphere itself was waiting. Then suddenly, small pieces of ice began falling. At first, people thought it might simply turn into snow, but within minutes, the frozen pellets grew larger and heavier. What started as a few scattered pieces of ice quickly turned into a violent hailstorm. Large hailstones began crashing down from the sky. They slammed against rooftops, shattered car windshields, and bounced violently across the streets. The sound of ice striking metal echoed through neighborhoods as people rushed for shelter. Some residents filmed the storm from their windows, capturing the strange moment when winter skies began dropping chunks of ice instead of snow. For many, the storm felt unusual. Hailstorms are typically associated with powerful summer storms, when warm air rises rapidly and creates unstable conditions in the atmosphere. Seeing large hailstones falling during the winter season felt strange and unexpected. It looked like the sky was throwing stones at us, one shop owner said while recording the storm on his phone. "I've lived here for years and never seen hail like this in the middle of winter." But the hail was only the beginning. As the storm slowly weakened, the sky did not clear. Instead, the clouds above grew darker and thicker, spreading across the horizon like a growing shadow. The wind began to rise, pushing through the streets and bending trees under its force. Branches rattled, street signs shook. Within minutes, what began as a strange winter hailstorm began transforming into something far more powerful. A massive storm system was forming. The air became heavier, and the sky darkened to an almost unnatural shade of gray. People looked upward, sensing that the storm had not yet reached its peak. Then came the lightning. At first, it appeared as distant flashes behind the clouds, but soon the lightning bolts became brighter, sharper, and much closer. Brilliant streaks of light ripped across the sky, followed by thunder that rolled across the land like a distant explosion. One powerful strike hit a large tree near the Kidron Valley. Witnesses said the lightning exploded into the trunk with a deafening crack. In seconds, the massive tree split apart and its roots were torn from the ground, leaving it collapsed across the street. The thunder was so loud it shook the windows, another resident said in a video shared online. When the lightning hit that tree, it felt like the ground jumped. Lightning continued flashing across the sky again and again, it illuminating the storm clouds in blinding bursts of light. To many watching the scene unfold, the storm felt overwhelming, almost ancient in its power. In the Bible, Storms and thunder are often described as signs of immense power in the heavens. One passage from the book of Psalms describes a similar moment of nature's force. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Psalm 29, 4-5. As thunder rolled across the sky and lightning split the clouds, some observers said the words felt strangely fitting. What had begun as an unusual winter hailstorm had now grown into a violent storm, filled with thunder and lightning powerful enough to split trees and shake the Holy Land. And for many people watching the sky that day, it felt like the first signal that something larger might be unfolding. Because when the thunder finally faded, another sign appeared, silent at first, yet impossible for anyone watching to ignore. If you want to see the next signs that may still be coming, make sure to hit the like button and keep watching. For a brief moment, the sky seemed calmer, but the rain did not stop. Instead, it kept falling, hour after hour. What began as a powerful storm slowly turned into relentless rainfall. Thick clouds blocked the sun while heavy sheets of water poured across the region without pause. At first, the streets simply looked wet, but as the hours passed, drainage systems began to fail. Puddles expanded into pools, and soon the water had nowhere left to go. Then the flooding began. No street remained safe. No car could move. No one could pretend it was just another storm. Within hours, water swallowed entire roads. Cars stalled in deep currents as drivers abandoned their vehicles and rushed toward higher ground. What had once been busy city streets were now something else entirely. Rivers, flowing straight through the city. Experts later explained that the ground was already saturated from the earlier storm. With nowhere left to drain, the relentless rain had nowhere to go. The water simply began spreading across the surface, turning streets and neighborhoods into channels for the flood. And once the water started moving, it moved fast. But the rising water was not the only thing people would soon notice that day. Something else was beginning to appear above the city. In residential areas, floodwater entered homes within hours. Outside the cities, farmlands suffered even greater damage. It happened so fast, one farmer said. The rain didn't stop, and suddenly the water was everywhere. In the Bible, floods are sometimes described as reminders of nature's overwhelming power. One passage from the Gospel of Matthew says, "The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house." Matthew 7-25. For many watching the water rise around them, those words felt painfully real. What began as strange storms in the sky had now reached the ground, flooding streets, entering homes, and changing lives across the region. And as the land struggled under rising water, attention began shifting above, toward another unsettling development that was beginning to unfold. A bright figure appeared in the sky. Witnesses said the luminous form hovered above the dome of the rock for several moments before slowly rising back into the clouds. Many who saw the scene believed they were looking at Jesus, surrounded by what appeared to be angels. "It's strange," one resident said quietly while watching the sky. "We thought everything would calm down after the floods, but now something else is happening." Some observers suggested that the intense military activity across the region, aircraft movements, flares, and defensive systems lighting up the sky, could sometimes create unusual visual effects in the clouds. During periods of conflict, the night sky above Jerusalem often becomes filled with flashes, reflections, and moving lights. But witnesses who saw the figure that night insist that this moment looked different. And they say the light did not flicker like a flare. It did not move like an aircraft. And it did not disappear like the brief flashes caused by missile interceptions. Yet many who witnessed the moment could not say for certain what the strange vision meant. For believers, the scene immediately brought to mind a well-known passage from the book of Revelation. "Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him." Revelation 1:7. Jerusalem has always stood at the center of biblical prophecy. The appearance of a radiant figure, believed by some to be Jesus, accompanied by angels, has left many wondering whether this moment carries a deeper meaning. Was this simply an unusual light in the sky after the storm? Or could it be a sign pointing to something far greater still unfolding? Yet at the same time that the strange lights were appearing in the sky, another disturbing event was unfolding on the ground. Across central Israel, powerful and unusual sounds suddenly echoed through several cities. The noises were so loud that many people stopped what they were doing, trying to understand where they were coming from. Residents in areas such as Gush Dan, Tel Aviv, and Petah Tikva reported hearing deep booms followed by strong vibrations that shook buildings and windows. Some people said the ground itself seemed to tremble for a moment. What made the situation even more puzzling was how far the sounds traveled. Reports soon came in from Julis, a town nearly 50 kilometers away from the original area. Authorities quickly began investigating. Police and military officials searched for possible explanations, but no clear cause was immediately found. Many people first assumed the sounds might be sonic booms from aircraft, rocket launches, or military drones. But those who heard them said this was different. The noise did not sound like jets. It did not sound like rockets. Instead, witnesses described something far stranger. Deep metallic echoes, low groaning tones, and vibrations that seemed to roll through the air like the sound of massive instruments being struck somewhere in the distance. Some even claimed they heard faint voices mixed within the strange noise, though no one could confirm what those sounds really were. As videos and recordings spread online, the mystery only grew. Were these simply unexplained atmospheric sounds during a time of conflict? Or could they be something far more unusual that people were only beginning to notice? Some people began thinking about the trumpet warnings described in the Bible. In those ancient passages, trumpets are often linked with moments when the world faces great change. One passage from Revelation says, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets." Revelation 8:1. For believers, sounds like these raise difficult questions. Could they be simple noises of war and nature? Or could they be something more symbolic, something meant to wake people up? At the same time, Israel has also been dealing with another familiar threat: swarms of locusts. With its dry desert climate and rising temperatures at the start of the hottest season, conditions in the region allow locusts to grow and multiply quickly. Warm winds and dry land can turn a small group of insects into a massive swarm within days. But the situation may also be connected to something larger happening across the region. In recent years, the water levels of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers have been steadily dropping. This growing shortage of water has already created serious pressure in neighboring countries like Syria and Iraq. Water shortages can damage farmland, force people to leave their homes, and increase tension between nations that rely on the same rivers. Instability in these regions can easily spread across borders. And when pressure rises in the Middle East, Israel is rarely far from the consequences. At the center of all these tensions stands one city that has never stayed quiet for long: Jerusalem. For thousands of years, Jerusalem has been watched by the world. Empires have fought for it. Nations have claimed it. Religions have prayed toward it. Few cities on earth carry the same weight. What makes Jerusalem so different from every other place? Why has this ancient city remained at the center of history, faith, and conflict for thousands of years? One reason is simple. Jerusalem is the only city in the world claimed as holy by the 3 major monotheistic religions. For the Jewish people, the land was sacred long before they lived there. According to the Bible, God promised it first to Abraham and later to Moses. Jerusalem eventually became the capital of King David, and the temple was built there as a symbol of God's covenant with his people. For Christians, Jerusalem is sacred because it is the place where Jesus was crucified and where believers say he rose again. For centuries, Christians have traveled from across the world to visit the holy sites within the city. For Muslims, Jerusalem is known as Al-Quds, meaning the holy. It was the first direction of prayer in early Islam and remains the third holiest city after Mecca and Medina. Because of this unique role in history and faith, Jerusalem stands at the crossroads of religion, politics, and prophecy. And when unusual events begin happening around the city, many people cannot help but wonder whether they carry a deeper meaning. Some believe these moments echo the signs described in the Bible, signs that many connect with the return of Christ. Whether coincidence or prophecy, one thing is certain. When something unusual happens in Jerusalem, the entire world pays attention. Wars and rumors of wars. Why Jesus said these are one of the signs of the times preceding his return. Of course, there have always been wars, but as events unfold in the Middle East and beyond, we must always seek to understand the times we are living in. We must remember that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has history in his hands. He is looking for a people who will trust only in him, not in the strength of military might, weapons, or human wisdom. As long as we live in this broken world, awaiting the coming of Messiah, national leaders must do all they can to seek justice and righteousness. This includes protecting the Jewish people from those who seek to annihilate them, such as the Islamist form of political Islam that currently rules in Tehran. Meanwhile, the Church has a unique task. As believers in the God of Israel and in His Word, our main responsibility is to watch and pray, discern the signs of the times, place our faith and trust in Him alone, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to intercede on behalf of God's people and of the whole creation that groans as in the pains of childbirth. Romans 8:22. And above all, to keep our eyes focused on heaven, from where we eagerly await our Savior. Philippians 3. Last Saturday morning, Israel and the U.S. launched a coordinated military campaign against the revolutionary Islamist regime in Iran. The conflict is now reaching the end of its first week. Here are some highlights and observations. This is not a new war, but a new phase in an ongoing armed conflict that was initiated by the revolutionary regime. Since it took power in 1979, it has built institutions, so strategies and operations directed at imposing its ideology on the people of Iran and exporting its apocalyptic Islamist ideology around the world. This involved deliberately attacking Jews and Israeli and U.S. citizens across the globe. Through its vast network of proxies and allies, it has built a massive military, political, commercial network directed at undermining the West. The final step was to develop nuclear weapons, which would enable it to destroy the infidels. Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion were launched when Israel and the U.S. believed there was a real and immediate danger that the Iranian regime would be able to attack with nuclear weapons. They have focused so far on reducing Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, eliminating its nuclear regime, and destroying its air defenses and other offensive military hardware. And the U.S. claims that it has destroyed Iran's navy. A key focus has been taking out key political and military leaders. Ayatollah Khamenei and many of the regime's political and military leaders have been killed. However, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the regime's main political/military arm, is still functioning and in control of the country. The U.S. quickly took control of the airspace over Iran. It has made significant inroads in destroying Iran's missile and drone capabilities. By March 5th, the Islamic Republic had already launched roughly 585 ballistic missiles and 1,500 drones. Tehran's remaining missile and drone combat formations continue to fight and still pose a serious threat. However, Tehran's missile and drone salvos have declined by roughly 70 to 85% since the first day of strikes, when Iran seeks to create a regional war. Some of these drones and missiles were directed at Israel, but the majority were directed against Gulf Arab states, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain. This suggests that Iran seeks to create a regional war, thereby pressuring Washington by its Gulf Arab partners. If this is the goal, it has so far been a failure. It remains to be seen whether the Gulf Arab states will fight back and conduct offensive operations in response. Tehran has even reportedly launched a ballistic missile towards Turkey, a country that is also driven by a radical Islamist ideology, but is also a host to key U.S. assets, and the only NATO member that borders Iran. Once strikes on NATO facilities in Turkey risk triggering greater NATO involvement, which could draw European countries into the conflict. On March 5th, drones originating from Iran struck the passenger terminal of Azerbaijan's international airport, injuring 2 people. While Iranian officials have denied involvement, this could indicate a widening of the conflict and even increase instability within Iran, given the large ethnic Azerbaijani population within the Islamic Republic. Another regional development concerns Lebanon. Hezbollah responded by attacking Israel on the northern border. The Lebanese government called for Hezbollah's military to be disbanded. Israel has launched ground and air operations into Lebanese territory. The conflict is already seriously disrupting global energy markets. With shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which handles about 1/5 of global oil consumption and LNG trade, has nearly come to a halt. Oil production in the Gulf states has been disrupted. Energy prices are skyrocketing. Qatar's energy ministers suggested that this war could bring down the economies of the world. International law. There is a lot of discussion about whether this military campaign is legal under international law. The justification from a legal perspective revolves around the precise scope of the right of states to self-defense, which is an exception to the general prohibition on the use of force against sovereign states and on interference with their political independence. The main argument in favor of legality is that this is part of a longer war that was initiated not by Israel or the United States, but by the Islamic revolutionary regime in Iran. In this context, both Israel and the United States have the right to take proportionate and necessary military action to protect themselves from the regime's incessant attacks on their citizens throughout the world, and to eliminate the threat, possibly a very real threat, that the regime would be very soon in a position to launch long-range ballistic nuclear missiles capable of reaching Europe, Israel, and even the United States. The precise nature of the threat and whether or not this is a necessary and proportionate response are matters for debate. Currently, we do not have the information necessary to reach a conclusive answer. But this obsession with international law reveals something deeper. An absence of a clear moral framework for analyzing and understanding conflicts of this nature. International law is only intended to provide a set of guidelines for political action. It is not and cannot be a detailed prescription for the foreign policy choices that must be made in any given situation. In fact, subservience to overly legalistic reasoning is likely to prevent the kind of political and military action that is necessary to confront the highly complex nature of the existential threat posed by political Islam to the West. The bigger geopolitical picture, there is a larger geopolitical dimension that is often overlooked but is becoming increasingly apparent. It concerns China and Russia. The war on the regime in Tehran is likely intended, at least in part, to address China's stronghold on key strategic assets that are essential to the West. As analyst Haviv Redig-Gur observes, Iran is strategically and economically very important for China, and China in turn is highly dependent on Iran. Russia, too, has deeply entwined interests. The U.S. is systematically removing key partners in China's ambitions for global hegemony. One of those was Venezuela. Another is the revolutionary regime in Iran. What does the future hold? It is impossible to predict how this conflict will play out. There are many unknowns. There has been much uncertainty about what exactly are the longer-term goals of this campaign and whether the U.S. has a strategy for achieving those goals. According to President Trump, the U.S. seeks not only to remove Iran's military threat, but also to provide space for the Iranian people to seize control and reclaim their country. However, it is not clear that the U.S. understands how military intervention and destruction of the current regime will lead to regime change. Nobody seems to have a roadmap. Iran is a vast country with many different nationalities and minorities. There are visible tensions between Reza Pahlavi, whose ambition is to lead Iran towards a new future, and the Kurdish dissident groups. Even assuming the U.S. and Israel are successful in winning this phase of the war militarily, it remains to be seen whether all of these groups will be able to work together to rebuild the nation peacefully. They need our prayers and support. Analyst Andrew Fox warns that while the Ayatollahs and their clerics may be eliminated, the IRGC and Basiji, Iranian paramilitary force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, may not be so easy to remove as the U.S. had hoped. The war risks falling between two stools. It is no longer just a narrow strike meant to punish or deter. The enemy always has a say, and Iran has caused enough damage to energy supply mechanisms to seriously harm the global economy. We have not seen any concrete plan for political transition, stabilization, or reconstruction so far. The war has destroyed enough to upset the old balance of power, but not enough to establish a better one. As a matter of statecraft, this war may end up being an extraordinary act of irresponsibility. This week, continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the people of Iran, watch that they will be freed from the tyranny of the current regime. Pray for the leaders of Israel and the United States and all nations affected by this crisis, that they will act with restraint, yet take whatever action is necessary to eliminate evil. Pray for the speedy coming of our Lord and Savior, the Messiah of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Guys, do you see that?
عارفه راجعه علينا عامله ازاي؟
Recently, frightening scenes began to unfold in Jerusalem as the sky suddenly darkened, swallowed by huge black clouds while fierce winds howled through the streets. Trees snapped, loose objects were blown across the roads, and rooftops began to shake as the storm quickly built strength. Within a narrow window of time, nature seemed to erupt in anger as heavy rain started pouring down, turning streets slippery and chaotic. In several areas, the strong winds damaged homes and shops, leaving many people shaken and some families without shelter. Many witnesses said they had never seen the sky over Jerusalem look so threatening. So, what exactly happened in Jerusalem that day? Was it simply a powerful storm? Or something that made people around the world start paying attention? If you want to follow the full story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. At first, many people thought it was just another storm forming over Jerusalem. Dark clouds gathering above the hills around the city were nothing new. Weather in this region can change quickly, and strong winds often arrive without much warning. But within a few minutes, people started to feel that this sky was different. The change happened fast. Across the city, the bright afternoon light slowly began to fade as large clouds moved in from the west. At first they looked like small patches of shadow drifting across the sky. But soon, the clouds grew bigger, thicker, and started spreading much faster. Within minutes, they covered most of the sky like a huge dark curtain. The sunlight that had filled the narrow streets just moments earlier began to disappear. The sky turned from light blue to a deep gray. The stone buildings, rooftops, and old city walls fell under a strange dim light that made everything feel a little unsettling. People began looking up. Some stopped in the middle of the street, staring at the sky, trying to understand what was going on. Others pointed toward the thick wall of clouds, moving closer. "It's getting dark way too fast," someone said in a video that later spread across social media. And they were right. The darkness didn't come slowly like a normal storm. It felt sudden, almost too quick, as if the sky had changed in only a few minutes. Then the wind arrived. At first, it was just a light breeze moving through the streets, but the air soon became stronger and more restless. Wind pushed through the narrow roads between the stone buildings, shaking signs and tree branches. Leaves lifted from the ground and spun through the air. Market tents began flapping hard. Papers scattered across the sidewalks. It was the kind of moment when people start to feel that something bigger might be coming. Across different parts of the city, daily life changed almost instantly. Many residents said they felt a strange sense of worry at that moment, a quiet feeling that this storm might be stronger than usual. Weather experts later explained that sudden changes like this can happen when large weather systems move across the eastern Mediterranean. Big differences in air pressure between the hot desert air and cooler air coming from the sea can quickly create powerful storms. But scientists also mentioned another possible factor. In recent days, missile interceptions, explosions, and heavy military activity can release heat, smoke, and tiny particles into the air. In some cases, these things can interact with weather systems already forming in the atmosphere. They don't create storms by themselves, but they can sometimes make weather patterns less stable, especially in a region already known for sudden desert winds and fast-moving storms. Still, events like this are difficult to measure, so confirming the exact cause is not easy. By now, the wind was roaring through the streets. Trees bent as strong gusts pushed against them. Power lines hummed softly as the wind rushed past. And above it all, the sky over the ancient city carried a strange feeling, something that didn't seem to fully match either normal weather or the tensions of war. For some people watching the sky, one thought came to mind almost immediately. What if this wasn't just another storm, but the beginning of something new and uncertain unfolding over Jerusalem? Just as the sky over the city grew darker and the wind continued to build, something unusual began to appear within the storm clouds. At first, it was only a brief flash of light, something many people assumed was ordinary lightning forming inside the thickening clouds. Storms often bring sudden flashes across the sky, and most residents barely paid attention at first. But this light did not behave like normal lightning. Instead of striking down in a sharp, blinding line, the light seemed to gather itself into a glowing shape, a small sphere of bright energy suspended within the clouds above the city. For a moment, it hovered. Several witnesses later said they thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. The glowing object appeared as a round ball of light, moving slowly across the sky, drifting through the dark storm clouds like a floating lantern. It was not the quick flash of lightning people were used to seeing during a storm. This light remained visible for several seconds, glowing with an intense white color with hints of orange that stood out sharply against the heavy gray sky. In several videos captured that evening, a glowing sphere could be seen moving silently through the clouds, flickering softly before fading, and then appearing again moments later. But something else was happening in the sky at the same time. Across the horizon above Jerusalem, distant flashes suddenly began appearing, thin streaks of light rising rapidly into the air. Interceptor missiles, launched from defense systems, streaked upward, while incoming rockets from neighboring regions crossed the sky in the opposite direction. Within seconds, the sky became a chaotic display of motion. The lightning appeared almost intertwined with the streaks of rockets. Brilliant white flashes erupted between the missile trails, illuminating the clouds for brief moments. Each burst revealed a sky filled with crossing lines of light, natural lightning, and human-made fire sharing the same horizon. For those watching from rooftops and balconies, the scene looked surreal. The glowing sphere drifted silently through the clouds, while lightning flashed violently nearby and missile trails burned across the sky. For a few seconds, the entire atmosphere above Jerusalem looked like a single massive canvas, a collision of storm, technology, and tension. Scenes like this quickly began spreading online as witnesses uploaded their recordings. Within hours, The mysterious lights and the strange sky above Jerusalem became one of the most discussed moments of the night. For many observers, the sky itself seemed to mirror the tension on the ground. Natural forces and human conflict appearing together in the same moment, as if the entire horizon was painting a scene that the world was still struggling to resolve. Some who watched quietly remembered a passage from the Bible often quoted when speaking about lightning and storms. For his lightning lights up the world. The earth sees it and trembles. Psalm 97:4. Above Jerusalem, the storm clouds continued to churn as the wind grew stronger. The glowing lights eventually disappeared, but the feeling they left behind remained. Many witnesses later said that was the moment they realized something unusual was unfolding. The storm that had begun with dark clouds and rising wind had now become something far more complex, and the sky above Jerusalem was only beginning to reveal its power. The strange lights in the sky had barely disappeared when the storm over Jerusalem finally showed its full power. What started as dark clouds and rising wind quickly turned into something much more dangerous. The air felt heavy, and the wind that had been moving lightly through the streets suddenly became strong and aggressive. Within minutes, powerful gusts rushed through neighborhoods across the city, shaking windows and rattling rooftops as if the storm had suddenly come alive. The wind kept getting stronger. Trees that had been standing still only minutes earlier began to bend under the pressure. Their branches whipped wildly through the air as strong gusts swept across streets and neighborhoods. Some trees could not handle the force. Large branches began snapping with sharp cracking sounds, falling onto roads and parked cars below. In some places, entire trees were pulled from the ground as the storm pushed forward without slowing down. Then, the rain arrived. At first, it came as a few scattered drops blowing sideways in the wind, but within seconds, the sky fully opened. Heavy rain poured down hard, hitting rooftops, streets, and open areas with non-stop force. Water quickly began running along the roads as drains struggled to keep up. Small puddles turned into streams, moving along sidewalks and through narrow streets. It suddenly became much harder to see. Drivers slowed down as rain slammed against their windshields. People walking outside rushed to stand under doorways and balconies, trying to escape the sudden downpour. Thunder echoed across the dark sky, while lightning flashed deep inside the storm clouds. The strong winds also reached the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Gusts pushed across open land and valleys, stirring dust and debris into the air. In some places, loose signs, chairs, and small objects were blown across courtyards and streets. Back inside the city, the damage slowly began to grow. In markets and small shops, owners tried to hold doors closed as the wind pushed against them. Outdoor stands were knocked over, as rain soaked everything in seconds. Pieces of broken branches and debris scattered across roads and sidewalks. Even animals reacted to the sudden change. Cats and stray dogs ran for cover under parked cars and building entrances. Birds struggled to fly through the heavy wind, some landing quickly on rooftops to escape the storm. Everywhere, the sound of the storm filled the air. Wind roared through the streets. Rain hammered against stone walls and metal rooftops. Tree branches cracked in the darkness as the storm continued to grow stronger. For many residents, it felt like the entire city was shaking under the force of nature. Some people watching the storm unfold remembered words written long ago in the Bible about moments when nature itself seemed to rise with overwhelming power. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Psalm 29:3. Above Jerusalem, the storm clouds continued to move and grow, pushed forward by powerful winds. What had begun as dark clouds and rising wind had now become a full and violent storm moving across the city. And for many watching that night, it felt like this was only the beginning. As the storm kept hitting Jerusalem, heavy rain continued falling for hours. The streets slowly began filling with water as the drainage systems struggled to keep up. What first looked like normal flooding soon started spreading into neighborhoods, covering roads, cars, and sidewalks with muddy water rushing through the city. In some areas, the water rose faster than people expected. At first, it only covered parts of the street. But soon the water began moving into homes and shops on lower levels. Doors were pushed open by the pressure of the water, and small windows cracked as the flood forced its way inside buildings. Before long, the situation became frightening. In several neighborhoods with lower ground levels, water climbed past doorways and started reaching windows. Families inside their homes had to move quickly upstairs to stay safe. Some people went from the first floor to the upper rooms, and in a few cases even climbed onto rooftops as the water continued rising below them. From above, the view looked alarming. Streets had turned into wide streams of muddy water. Cars were half covered, and only the tops of some vehicles could still be seen. People stood on balconies and rooftops, waving their arms and calling for help, hoping someone nearby would notice them. Some parents held their children close as they waited. Others stood carefully along railings or narrow roof edges, trying to stay above the water that surrounded them. Fear spread quickly as the strong current carried debris through the streets that now looked more like rivers. Cars slowly drifted away like abandoned objects. Trash bins, broken branches, wooden boards, and pieces of fences floated through the rushing water as the flood pushed through parts of the city. Soon, emergency sirens began echoing through the rain. Rescue teams started moving toward the flooded areas as reports spread across Jerusalem. Police, firefighters, and emergency workers arrived with trucks, ropes, and rescue equipment. Some teams used small boats to reach people trapped by the rising water. But helping everyone was not easy. The water moved quickly through narrow streets. In some places, the current was strong enough to push against rescue vehicles. The muddy water also hid dangerous obstacles under the surface, including fallen branches, damaged signs, and broken pieces of buildings. Some rescuers threw ropes toward people waiting on balconies or rooftops. Others carefully moved boats between buildings, helping families climb in one by one. In several tense moments, people were pulled from rooftops and lifted into rescue boats while the water continued rushing around them. In a few areas, however, the water was still too strong. Rescue teams had to wait for safer conditions before moving closer. Through loudspeakers, emergency workers told residents to stay on higher floors or rooftops until help could safely reach them. Above the city, helicopters soon appeared in the dark sky. Their blades roared through the storm as crews searched for people trapped by the rising water. In some rescues, ropes were lowered from the aircraft while people were lifted to safety one by one. Yet even as help arrived, the rain continued falling. Dark storm clouds still hung over Jerusalem, feeding the water that had already spread through parts of the city. With every passing hour, new reports came in about flooded streets and people needing assistance. For many watching the situation unfold, the scene reminded them of words written long ago in the Bible. "The floods have risen, Lord, the floods have lifted their voice. The floods lift up their waves." Psalm 93:3. Across Jerusalem, water continued moving through streets and neighborhoods, carrying debris and forcing families to wait for rescue. And with the storm clouds still gathering above the city, many feared that the worst might not be over yet. Even as heavy rain and flooding continued in parts of Jerusalem, another frightening part of the storm began to appear. High above the dark clouds covering the city, the atmosphere was becoming more unstable. Cold air moving through the upper sky crashed into rising warm air below, creating huge thunderclouds that twisted and rolled like giant towers overhead. What fell from those clouds next surprised many people. At first, only a few small pieces of ice hit the ground. They bounced lightly off rooftops and streets, catching people off guard. Many residents were already watching the storm carefully, but these first pieces of ice didn't seem too serious. Then, the sound suddenly changed. The sky began dropping something much stronger. Large hailstones started falling from the clouds. They slammed into rooftops, cars, and streets with sharp cracking sounds. What started as a few scattered pieces of ice quickly turned into a heavy hailstorm, as dozens, then hundreds of frozen stones fell across neighborhoods and streets. The noise quickly became loud and chaotic. Hail pounded against metal roofs like rocks being thrown from the sky. Windows shook as ice hit the glass. People who were still outside immediately ran for cover as the storm kept getting stronger. Some hailstones were about the size of golf balls. Others looked even bigger. When they hit the ground, they broke apart and scattered pieces of ice across the sidewalks and roads. Cars parked along the streets quickly started showing damage. Windshields cracked under the hits, and dents appeared on hoods and roofs as the ice kept falling. In some areas, the hail came down so heavily that the streets started turning white. Drivers who had been trying to move through the storm suddenly slowed down or stopped completely. Visibility dropped, and the roads became slippery and dangerous. Many people pulled their cars to the side and waited inside, hoping the hailstorm would end before their vehicles were badly damaged. Across neighborhoods, the sound of hail hitting rooftops echoed through the storm. Roof tiles cracked after repeated impacts. Metal roofing rattled loudly as the ice struck again and again. In a few homes, small glass skylights broke, letting rain and ice fall into the rooms below. People rushed indoors as fast as they could. Pedestrians ran from sidewalks into shops, restaurants, and apartment buildings, raising their arms over their heads to protect themselves from the falling ice. Some tried using umbrellas or bags as shields, but the hailstones were too large and too strong to stop easily. Parents shouted for their children to come inside right away. Street vendors quickly left their stands as the ice began hitting their carts and tables. Within minutes, outdoor markets that had been busy just moments earlier were suddenly empty as people ran for shelter. Even animals reacted to the sudden violence of the storm. Birds flew away from rooftops, searching for cover under bridges and building edges. Stray cats and dogs ran toward doorways as residents quickly opened doors to let them inside. Above all the chaos, thunder kept rolling across the sky. Lightning flashed inside the massive storm clouds, lighting up the falling hail for a few seconds at a time. For some people watching the storm, the scene brought to mind ancient words written about powerful storms. He loads the thick cloud with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. Job 37:11. Above Jerusalem, the storm continued to grow stronger. Rain, wind, hail, and thunder were now moving together in one powerful system, shaking the city. What had begun as dark clouds earlier in the day had turned into a full display of nature's force. And even as the hail kept falling, many people could feel that the storm was not finished yet. If you are still watching, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. As the storm over Jerusalem kept getting stronger, the sky above the city started looking even more unstable. Dark clouds rolled and twisted across the sky like giant waves. Thunder echoed across the hills while rain and hail continued hitting rooftops and streets below. Many people watching the sky felt like the storm had already reached its worst point. But what appeared next shocked even those who had already seen how powerful the storm had become. Inside the thick storm clouds, something strange began to happen. High above the ground, part of the cloud slowly started spinning. At first it was hard to see clearly through the heavy rain and darkness, but after a few moments, the movement became easier to notice. The center of the cloud began pulling downward, stretching toward the ground like the storm itself was reaching down. Then it happened. A long, funnel-shaped column of spinning wind dropped from the cloud. The dark, twisting shape reached down from the sky, like a rope made of wind. Slowly at first, then faster, the funnel stretched lower and lower until it finally touched the ground. A tornado had formed. The moment the spinning column connected with the earth, the wind grew much stronger. Dust and debris were quickly pulled into the air. Leaves, dirt, and broken branches began spinning around the funnel as it gained strength. Within seconds, damage started appearing. The tornado moved across open areas and roads, tearing through anything in its path. Trees that had already been weakened by the storm suddenly snapped as the powerful wind twisted through their branches. Some trees were even pulled out of the ground, their roots lifted into the air before being thrown aside. Nearby rooftops began shaking violently as the wind passed. In several places, pieces of metal roofing were ripped off and thrown through the air like paper. Wooden fences broke apart as the tornado crossed open land, scattering boards and debris across the ground. Small structures like sheds were destroyed in seconds. The sound of the tornado was terrifying. Many witnesses later said it sounded like a loud jet engine or a fast-moving train roaring through the air. The wind screamed as it spun faster and faster, pulling everything into its path. People who saw the funnel coming quickly ran for safety. Some rushed into buildings, while others moved to lower floors or rooms without windows. Anyone caught outside could only watch in shock as the spinning column of wind moved across the land. Above the chaos, lightning kept flashing inside the dark storm clouds, lighting up the tornado for a few seconds at a time. For some people, the frightening scene reminded them of words written long ago in the Bible. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm. Nahum 1-3. The tornado continued moving across the area, lifting debris high into the sky, while thunder and rain surrounded it. Trees, broken branches, and pieces of rooftops spun through the air as the storm showed one of its most violent moments. And as the dark funnel moved beneath the stormy sky over Jerusalem, many people realized the storm had reached a level of destruction they had never expected. As the storm kept moving across Jerusalem, many people thought they had already seen the worst of it. Heavy rain had flooded some streets, strong winds had shaken buildings, and hail had already caused damage in several areas. But high above the city, in the colder hills around Jerusalem, the storm showed another surprising change that few people expected. While the lower parts of the city were still dealing with rain and flooding, the air in the higher areas started getting colder. The powerful storm system carried a huge amount of moisture, and as the clouds moved over higher ground where the temperature was lower, the weather began to shift. The rain slowly started to change. What began falling from the sky, there was no longer just rain. It was snow. At first, only a few small flakes appeared. They floated slowly through the wind, looking like tiny white sparks against the dark sky. People in the higher neighborhoods looked outside in surprise as the temperature suddenly dropped and the rain turned into light snow. But the snowfall did not stay gentle for long. Within minutes, the wind grew stronger again, pushing the snow across the air with force. What started as a few scattered flakes quickly turned into a heavy snowstorm as thick clouds released waves of snow over the hills, roads, and neighborhoods. Visibility dropped quickly. The wind blew snow sideways across the streets, covering roads, rooftops, and trees with layers of white. Drivers moving through the hill roads had to slow down or stop as the path ahead slowly disappeared behind blowing snow. The scene felt almost unreal. In some parts of the city, people were still dealing with heavy rain and standing water, while in the higher areas, the same storm was covering the ground with snow and ice. It felt like the weather had suddenly lost balance. Residents in those colder areas quickly prepared for the sudden snowfall. Doors and windows were closed tightly as cold wind pushed against the buildings. People put on thicker jackets and watched as the ground outside slowly turned white. Snow started building up on rooftops and along narrow roads. Tree branches bent under the growing weight while the wind howled through the hills, sending waves of snow spinning through the air like white clouds. Some drivers who had been traveling through those areas suddenly found themselves stuck as the roads became slippery and dangerous. Cars pulled over to the side as drivers waited, hoping the storm would calm down before the snow blocked the road completely. The strange difference in weather left many people shocked. In one part of the city, rain and floodwater were still causing problems. In another area, the same storm was freezing the land under falling snow. It almost felt like the elements themselves were fighting each other. Thunder continued rumbling through the sky as lightning flashed above the clouds, lighting up the blowing snow for a few seconds at a time. For some people watching the storm, the scene reminded them of words written long ago in the Bible. He says to the snow, "Fall on the earth, and to the rain be a mighty downpour. Job 37:6. The storm over Jerusalem kept moving, bringing rain, wind, hail, flooding, and now even snow to different parts of the region. What started earlier as dark clouds and rising wind had now turned into something far more unpredictable. And as people watched the strange weather unfold, many felt the same thought crossing their minds. It seemed like nature itself had completely lost control. Just when it seemed the storm had already caused enough damage in Jerusalem, another frightening moment arrived that no one expected. Across the city, people were still trying to deal with everything the storm had left behind. Emergency teams were moving through wet streets, residents were clearing branches and debris, and families stood outside their homes, hoping the worst was finally over. But under the soaked ground and shaken city, another force was building. Then suddenly, the ground moved. At first it was very light, almost like a small vibration passing through the earth. Some people inside their homes felt a slight shake under their feet. It was the kind of feeling that makes you stop for a moment and wonder if something just shifted. But within seconds, the shaking became stronger. Walls began to tremble. Windows rattled loudly inside buildings. Chairs and tables moved slightly across the floor as the ground continued shaking under entire neighborhoods. What started as a small tremor quickly turned into something much more serious. An earthquake had begun. Across Jerusalem, people felt the ground suddenly moving beneath them. Buildings creaked as the structures reacted to the motion. Hanging lights swung back and forth, and objects on shelves started falling to the floor. Fear spread quickly. Families rushed toward doors and stairways, trying to get outside as fast as possible. Some people shouted warnings to neighbors, while others grabbed their children and ran into open streets. Outside, the shaking felt even more frightening. Cars parked along the roads rocked slightly as the ground moved under them. Power lines swayed above the streets, and a deep rumbling sound could be heard in the distance. In some places, small cracks appeared in walls and pavement as the shaking continued. People stood frozen in shock, watching the ground beneath their feet. Many residents had already spent hours dealing with dangerous weather. Strong winds had shaken buildings, hail had damaged cars and homes, and heavy rain had flooded parts of the city. Now even the earth itself seemed to join the chaos. Some people dropped to their knees in fear. Others raised their voices in prayer as the shaking continued. In moments like this, many remembered words written long ago in the Bible. The earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains shook. Psalm 18:7. The shaking lasted only a short time, but for the people experiencing it, those seconds felt much longer. Slowly, the movement began to stop. Buildings stopped rattling. Power lines became steady again. The ground slowly returned to calm. But the fear did not disappear. Residents stood quietly in the streets, looking back at their homes and buildings, unsure of what damage might have happened. Some checked on family members and neighbors to make sure everyone was safe. Others simply looked up at the sky, still dark with storm clouds, trying to understand everything that had just taken place. In just one day, Jerusalem had faced powerful storms, heavy rain, hail, strong winds, sudden snow in the hills, and now an earthquake. For many people who witnessed it, it felt like the peak of a long chain of disasters. Nature had shown nearly all of its power, and standing there among wet streets and shaken buildings, many residents realized they had just lived through one of the most intense and frightening days they could remember.
شيء هائل يا جماعة. لا
Moments like this are not unusual simply because they never happen.
كف صوت الجاز كف.
شيء هائل يا جماعة. لا
Moments like this are not unusual simply because they never happen. What made it striking was when it happened. In a narrow window of time, the sky above Jerusalem changes, and suddenly the world begins paying attention. The air grew heavy. The crowd slowed near the Western Wall. For a brief moment, thousands stood in silence, watching something they couldn't fully explain. It wasn't only the event itself that caught attention, but the timing, arriving after a series of tense moments that had already unsettled the atmosphere in the city. Within hours, stories began spreading far beyond Jerusalem, leaving people everywhere asking the same question. Could this be connected to something foretold long ago? In this video, we'll walk through the events step by step and explore this particular moment through the light of faith in Scripture. For centuries, Jerusalem has stood as one of the most sacred places on earth, a city of prayer, history, and quiet devotion. Within its ancient walls, the Western Wall Plaza remains a place where thousands gather each day, pressing their hands against the stones, whispering prayers carried through generations. People come expecting stillness, reflection, continuity. But on one evening, something changed. At first, it was movement in the air, not a few insects drifting near the lamps, not a small cluster drawn to the light. This was different. The sky above the plaza seemed to ripple with motion. Dark shapes began circling the bright lights that illuminate the stone courtyard beneath the towering walls of the Temple Mount. Within minutes, it became impossible to ignore. There were locusts, and there were many of them. They swarmed around the floodlights above the western wall, filling the night air with restless movement. Some descended onto the pale stone pavement. Others clung briefly to the ancient blocks of the wall itself before lifting again into the air. Their motion formed thick waves circling the lights, shifting constantly as if the sky itself had begun to move. At first, the sound was faint. A soft flutter carried through the night, but as their numbers grew, the air began to hum with the rhythm of wings. Worshippers slowed their steps. The usual quiet flow of people moving toward the wall did not stop, but it changed. Heads tilted upward. Eyes followed the swirling shapes above the plaza. Some stepped aside, watching closely. Others continued their prayers, glancing upward between whispered words. No announcement was made. No warning was given. Yet the sight was undeniable. The swarm moved as a single living mass, sweeping across the lights in thick spirals. From certain angles, it looked almost like smoke rising against the dark sky above Jerusalem's old stones. From others, it formed dense clouds that briefly dimmed the lights before scattering again into shifting patterns. Someone began recording, then another. Within minutes, phones were lifted across the plaza. Wide shots captured the insects filling the air above the western wall. Close-up videos showed locusts landing on the stone ground. Slow-motion clips revealed the swarm moving in heavy waves around the lights. What made the moment powerful was not chaos. It was contrast. As the ancient stones of the western wall stood unmoved, silent as they have for centuries, while the air above them churned with restless motion. Worshippers continued their prayers beneath a shifting cloud of wings. The sacred and the sudden existed together in the same frame. Soon the videos began spreading online. Viewers replayed the footage again and again, trying to understand the scale of what they were seeing. Some zoomed in, pointing out how dense the swarm appeared around the lights. Comments filled with questions. Had this happened before? Was this common? Why did it seem so intense? For some, the images quietly echoed ancient words recorded long ago. They covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened. Exodus at 10:15. The footage did not show panic. It showed attention. Even those who continued walking seemed more aware of the moment. The usual movement across the plaza felt slower, as if people sensed that this was not an ordinary sight. Children pointed toward the sky. Adults watched silently. Workers crossing the plaza stepped carefully around insects gathered on the ground. Under the bright lights, the swarm looked almost surreal. The locusts circled endlessly around the illumination, forming dense loops that sometimes thickened enough to dim the glow before breaking apart again. Their presence was impossible to overlook. From nearly every corner of the plaza, the movement could be seen. And yet, the wall remained still. That stillness made the motion above it feel even more striking. From above, the scene would have appeared extraordinary. The ancient stones at the center, worshippers gathered below, and above them a dark, shifting cloud in constant motion beneath the night sky of Jerusalem. No one seemed certain how long it would last. No one was ready to say what it meant. It was simply happening. Some people captured the moment quietly. Others watched without speaking. A few appeared thoughtful, everyone as if weighing what they saw against everything they expected this place to be. There was no single reaction, only the awareness that something unusual was unfolding in plain sight. The swarm had not arrived slowly over hours. It appeared suddenly, thick, visible, undeniable. And because of where it appeared, the moment carried weight beyond its size. Insects in the night sky are ordinary, but locusts filling the air above the Western Wall in Jerusalem feel different. The evening that began with quiet prayer now carried another layer of attention. Not fear, not chaos, but a sharpened awareness created by contrast. The sacred stones remained unchanged, but the air above them told another story. And as the videos continued to circulate far beyond Jerusalem, one thought quietly repeated across countless screens. This was not something people were used to seeing. What came after this surprised even more people. So stay with us. Wait, and leave a like if you're ready to see the next part. At first, many believed it was simply nature. The first drops of rain were barely noticeable. In Jerusalem, rain is not unheard of, but during certain seasons, the sky often remains calm and clear above the ancient stone city. That evening, when the first light droplets touched the stones near the Western Wall, many worshippers simply paused and looked upward with mild surprise. A few smiled. Others lifted their hands, feeling the cool water against the warm evening air. At first it felt refreshing, brief, harmless, but the rain did not stop. It grew heavier. Dark clouds began gathering above the old city, thick and fast, rolling over the hills that were surround Jerusalem. The sky dimmed as the clouds pressed together, bringing with them a weight that felt unusual for such a peaceful evening. Soon the sound of rain echoed across the wide plaza before the Western Wall, striking the pale limestone ground and the ancient stones themselves. The smooth stone floor began to shine beneath the falling water. People continued moving, but more slowly now. Some stepped back toward the covered areas along the edges of the plaza. Others remained where they were, watching the rain fall harder with every passing minute. The atmosphere shifted, not into panic, but into quiet awareness. Something about the moment felt different. Water began to collect. At first, thin streams ran across the worn stone surface, flowing gently through the slight slopes of the plaza. Then the streams widened, joining together as the rain continued. Reflections of the lights trembled on the wet ground, turning the courtyard into a shifting mirror of gold and shadow. Soon the water spread closer to the base of the Western Wall itself. Images captured from above showed a scene few expected to witness. The ancient stones standing firm, while water rippled across the plaza below. Worshippers moved carefully through the shallow pools, their dark coats and prayer shawls reflecting across the shining stone beneath their feet. The sight was striking. Jerusalem is often imagined through its stone. Dry walls, dusty streets, and sunlit hills stretching beyond the city gates. Yet now water flowed across the sacred plaza, transforming the familiar space into something almost unrecognizable. The contrast alone was enough to make people stop and look. Videos began spreading quickly online. Some clips showed rain pouring across the limestone floor. Others captured the reflections of the Western Wall shimmering in moving water. Viewers around the world replayed the footage, trying to understand what they were seeing. The mood online slowly shifted. Where the earlier swarm of insects had sparked curiosity, the storm brought something heavier, a quiet sense of concern, not fear but uncertainty. How unusual was this? Had the plaza ever looked like this before? Was it simply a rare storm, or another strange moment unfolding after the last? No one rushed to explain. The rain continued steadily, turning the open plaza into a landscape shaped by sound and motion. The air cooled as the rhythm of water striking stone filled the night. The ancient wall remained unchanged at the center of it all, its massive blocks darkened by rain, steady against the shifting scene around it. Some worshippers continued their prayers despite the weather, stepping carefully across the wet ground. Others paused beneath the rain, watching quietly, as if trying to remember the moment, because it felt unusual, not dramatic in a loud way, but powerful in contrast. A sacred place known for stability, now surrounded by flowing water, reflecting lights that trembled with every ripple. And as the rain finally began to ease, one thought lingered quietly among those who later watched the videos. The atmosphere had changed. Something about the sequence of events, first the swarm in the sky, then the sudden storm, made people look more closely than before. But this was only the beginning. As the rain slowly faded and the water drained away from the stone plaza, many believed the strange moments had ended. The sky above Jerusalem seemed to grow quiet again. The wet ground reflected the fading lights, and people began returning to their usual rhythm of prayer near the western wall. But the sky was not finished yet. The air felt different that day. Clouds hung low over the old city earlier than expected, spreading across the sky in thick gray layers. Wind began moving through the open plaza, stronger than usual, brushing against prayer shawls and loose clothing. The sound of it echoed softly along the ancient stones. Some people continued their prayers, but others looked upward, sensing the change before anything had actually happened. Towering above the skyline were several construction cranes from nearby restoration and building projects around Jerusalem. They had become part of the background of the city, tall metal frames standing quietly above the rooftops and stone walls. Most people barely noticed them anymore, until the wind strengthened. It arrived in sudden bursts, only sweeping across the plaza with a force that felt sharper than before. Dust lifted from nearby streets. Loose materials rattled somewhere beyond the walls. The peaceful atmosphere shifted subtly, turning tense in just a few moments. Then something changed. One of the massive cranes near the old city began to move. At first, the motion was almost imperceptible, a slight tilt that could have been mistaken for a trick of the eye against the dark clouds. But seconds later, the movement became clear. The towering metal structure leaned farther, its long arms shifting slowly against the sky. People began looking up. Some paused where they stood. Others instinctively stepped back. The sound came next. A deep metallic groan carried by the wind, echoing through the open space around the ancient walls. And then it fell. The collapse happened suddenly. The enormous crane tipped forward and crashed downward with tremendous force. Metal tore through the air before striking the ground somewhere beyond the nearby buildings. The impact produced a heavy echo that seemed to roll across the city for a brief moment. For a split second, everything felt still. Then voices rose. People began moving quickly, some running, others trying to understand what had just happened. The calm rhythm that usually defined the plaza vanished instantly. The wind continued pushing through the open space while confusion spread across the crowd. And in moments like this, some people quietly remembered words long written in scripture. The earth shakes and trembles. The foundations of the mountains quake. Psalm 18:7. The atmosphere changed completely. Some visitors stepped away from the open areas. Others tried to look toward the direction where the crane had fallen. Phones appeared as people began recording the dark sky and the distant sounds of movement beyond the walls. For a moment, the ancient city felt unexpectedly fragile. And the crane that had once stood high above the skyline now lay broken somewhere beyond view. A stark reminder of how quickly ordinary scenes can transform into something else. Emergency vehicles could soon be heard in the distance, their sounds echoing faintly through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. Videos began spreading online almost immediately. Clips showed the dark clouds over the old city, the violent movement of the crane against the sky, and the moment it disappeared from view. And people around the world replayed the footage, trying to understand how something so large could collapse so suddenly. This moment felt different from the earlier events. The insects had sparked curiosity. The rain had created concern. But this introduced something new: vulnerability. Another line of scripture quietly surfaced in the minds of some viewers watching the footage later. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Psalm 56:3. The mood had shifted everywhere. Even as the wind continued moving through the plaza, the ancient stones of the western wall remained exactly where they had stood for centuries. Silent, unmoved, steady amid the tension around them. That contrast stayed with many witnesses. Above them, the sky remained dark. The wind whispered along the stone surfaces. Conversations became quieter as people tried to piece together what they had just seen. No one rushed to explain it. No one tried to assign meaning too quickly. It was simply real, a sudden event that transformed curiosity into something heavier. And as the city slowly settled again beneath the dark sky, one quiet thought seemed to linger in the background. If something like this could happen so suddenly, what might come next? After the chaos slowly settled, the atmosphere around the western wall felt quieter, but not entirely calm. The wind still moved gently through the open plaza, softer now, carrying the cool scent of rain and stone. And people began returning to their rhythm of prayer and quiet conversation. Some stepped closer to the ancient wall again, placing their hands against the weathered stones. Others walked slowly across the plaza. Yet something in the air felt different, as if the evening in Jerusalem had not fully finished unfolding. Then the sky changed. At first, it was only a distant flicker of light behind the clouds, a brief flash that many barely noticed. But soon another followed, brighter this time, stretching across the dark sky above the old city. Moments later came the sound. A deep roll of thunder moved across the hills surrounding Jerusalem, echoing faintly through the narrow streets and across the open plaza. Heads lifted again. Visitors and worshippers slowed their steps, their attention drawn upward as flashes of lightning began appearing between the thick clouds. The sky seemed alive, shifting from darkness to sudden brightness and back again.